Okay, so that's a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. We'll do a little bit more housekeeping at the end. We'll have a Q&A session at the end as well. But let's get into this evening's lesson, okay? So what are we covering tonight in the photography lesson? Well, we're going to have a look at some of the basic functions on our cameras. Okay, so we dipped in a little bit into this in the first lesson. We broke down very, very basically some of the terminology surrounding our cameras. But tonight, we're going to get a lot deeper into it. We're going to have a look at the different modes on our cameras, the different dials, and so on. We're also going to have a look at lenses. But before we get into lenses, we're also going to see how the camera sees versus how we see. And this is an important thing to understand, because how we see the world is very different from how our cameras see the world. And when we understand that, it will help us to understand our lenses a lot better as well. Okay, and this will help you to make better choices about the types of lenses to purchase and so on, if you're thinking about getting any lenses in the future and that. And then we'll have our summary, and we'll do a little bit of course interaction. We'll have our Q&A and everything at the end of the lesson as well. So is everybody excited to dive into lesson 2? Excellent. Lisa is excited. Sabrina is excited. Zena, Paul, Alina, fantastic. Great stuff, guys. Well, let's not waste any more time. Well, first of all, why is it important to learn about camera functions? Okay, well, it's all about gaining a better technical understanding. We spend a lot of money on cameras. We spend a lot of money on lenses. And if we're thinking about investing in a new camera and thinking about investing in a new lens and so on, and you're looking out there, you can see it's a huge amount of money to be parting with. You want to make sure that you're making the right purchase for yourself, that you're picking the right lens or you're picking the right camera for yourself. If you are more confident in your technical knowledge about cameras, and you're more confident, you can approach things the way that you want. You're going to have a better idea of what camera and lens suits you. But it's also going to mean that you're going to be able to pick something that's going to help achieve your creative vision for your photography a lot better. Without this kind of knowledge, you're going to have a lack of understanding of the technical capabilities of a camera, and you'll have a lack of confidence in your skills, and this reflects in your photographs as well. The best photographers are confident photographers, and this is something that I really wanted to help you guys with, is I want to get you a lot more confident about your photography, and that's done through understanding your cameras and your lenses. So as it's the same with our cameras, lenses as well. We need to understand the capabilities of the equipment that we are using. And this goes for not just what our lenses can do, but it's also understanding what our lenses can't do as well. Sometimes you might be using a lens and you're getting really frustrated because you're trying to capture a particular photograph, and you simply can't capture it because you haven't got the right lens, okay? So confidence in this area as well will really help you to select the right lenses to match what your vision is for the image. But it also helps you to develop what we call a visual awareness. A visual awareness so that we have a good idea of how a photograph is going to look even before we take the photograph, okay? So let's get straight into it. Now, for the purposes of this lesson, I am going to be using the buttons and dials from a digital single lens reflex camera, a DSLR. The main reason for this is that DSLRs will have the most functions. They generally have all functions that a photographer will require. But most of the icons and the functions on your cameras, they are universal. So don't worry if you don't have a DSLR, if you're using a bridge camera, a mirrorless camera, a point and shoot. You're going to see a lot of these dials on these cameras as well. Again, if I mention a function you haven't seen before, you might have a quick glance at your camera's manual and just see if your camera has this function as well. This lesson is very, very good, for helping you to understand your camera's manuals as well. So, I mentioned it in the first lesson. I said sometimes when we have a look at our camera's manuals, they're filled with jargon. They're filled with all these kind of terminology that we don't understand. But throughout these lessons, it'll help you to decipher that, and thus it'll help you to understand your camera a lot better as well. So let's have a look at the mode selector first of all. How many of you have a camera that has a dial that's similar to this? Now, you might not have one that's exactly like this. Yes, lots of people saying yes, yes. So we're all quite familiar with this. Even if you have a camera that's just a film camera, you have a dial that's going to be really, really similar to this. This is our mode selector, okay? And this is the dial that allows you to change the way the camera takes a picture, okay? So just going back to lesson 1 very briefly, when we looked at camera types, I did mention point and shoot cameras. And as I said, with the point and shoot cameras, they are a little bit more basic, so they may not have the option of changing the shooting modes. But quite often the shooting modes are actually hidden within the menu system itself. So if your camera doesn't have a dial like this, sometimes it's actually hidden in the actual menus of the camera as well. So again, just refer to your camera's manual to find out where this one is located. But for the majority of us, it's generally going to be on the top of the camera so that we can quickly access it and change it. So let's break it down. And Martin, you're just asking, how is P different to auto? Well, that's exactly what we're just about to have a look at, Martin, okay? So first off, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this mode. How many of you want to get away from this mode? The fully automatic. Yes, yeah, Judy, you want to get away from it. Joel, you want to get away. Yeah, Peter's saying the same. Yeah, absolutely. We're here because we want to move away from this mode. Automatic mode tells the camera to make the best judgment about all the settings to capture the picture for you. And this can be great if you're just trying to capture a scene without having to think about the technical side. You just want to point, you just want to shoot, or maybe you're under a little bit of pressure and you just want to get the shot to make sure that you don't miss it. It could be a great mode for that. However, using automatic mode, the camera has no idea what you want to capture, and it doesn't know whether you want to freeze a moving subject or if you want to blur that subject. It has no idea if you want to blur a background in a portrait or if you want to keep everything sharp and in focus like in a landscape photograph. It does not know what your creative vision is for the scene. Basically, automatic removes all creative control and it just captures the scene with whatever combination of settings the camera thinks is best to make sure that the correct amount of light is in the scene. Automatic mode just wants to make sure that the exposure is correct, but it does not know anything else about what you're trying to achieve with the photograph. Okay, so moving away from the automatic mode, let's have a look at some of the other modes. So Martin was just asking, what's the difference with automatic and program mode? Okay, well, they are quite similar. And I do get often asked that question. But I have to say, I find program mode to be a more useful mode than the automatic mode. And the reason for this is program mode is an advanced semi-automatic function where the camera sets your shutter speed and your aperture for you, but it does allow you to change some of these settings as well if you need to. So you can change, if you're finding that the aperture it's selected for you isn't the correct one that you want, you can still change your aperture in this mode. It will change your shutter speed to reflect that as well, so it still controls the other elements of the shot, but you do have some more control when you're using the program mode. And I have to say, I find this mode to be a very useful one. I would use this mode quite frequently when I'm trying to take the pressure off myself, and perhaps just want to try and enjoy myself a little bit more. Program mode means I can shoot away, generally get a good shot, but I can still control that part of the camera, like changing my ISO, changing my shutter speed, my aperture if I need to as well, okay? So it's a great mode to go to if you're trying to get away from that fully automatic mode where the camera is doing everything for you. The stepping stone into the program mode. Into the fully manual mode. Does everybody understand that difference between auto and program? Program is still quite an automatic mode, but it gives you that little bit more control compared to the fully auto, which you have no control overall. The best example I think of this is if you have a camera that has a pop-up flash. So if you're using a Nikon D3300 or a Canon 1300D and so on, with the pop-up flash, automatic, I find, always tries to use that pop-up flash, and that really, really frustrates me because it's always throwing the flash on if there's not enough light in the scene. But if you go to program mode, it doesn't do that for you. You have to manually pop up the flash. That's a really good way of just showing you the difference between the two modes straight away. The program won't try and rely on that flash. Automatic mode really just wants to get the exposure right for you. We're programming to get that little bit more control over it. Moving away from that then, we also have these icons here. These are known as preset modes, and these are designed to try and capture the best possible shots in a variety of situations. And as you can see, the little icons give you a good indicator of what it is they're trying to do. Now, when I say try to capture the subject the way you want it, I really mean they only try. The problem with any of these automatic functions is that the camera doesn't know what your vision for the scene or the picture is. And for most people who use these preset modes, the biggest frustration comes from the camera not being able to replicate the picture or the scene the way that you wanted to capture it. And this is why we want to eventually move away from these modes. We want to get to that fully manual mode. So let's just break these guys down and just give you a brief explanation on how they work. So the sports mode or the action mode, the little running man symbol. This is a mode, this is where the camera will try to give you a combination of settings to capture moving subjects, fast moving subjects. It attempts to freeze the action. And this is done by controlling the shutter speed, which we'll talk about a lot more in lesson 4. And this is a really good mode for people playing sports, for moving vehicles, for wildlife, basically anything that's in motion. Can anybody give me an example where this is, there's a particular example in my head I'm thinking of where this comes in incredibly handy. What would be a very fast-moving subject that we would perhaps encounter on a day-to-day basis? Angel, you're saying motocross. Well, maybe not motocross for everybody. I can see someone got the answer there. Racing and cars, yeah, absolutely, you're on the right kind of line. But think of something more everyday, something you might encounter every single day in your own household. Yeah, Valeria, you're absolutely right. Children move at the speed of light. They're so hard to capture. They're just constantly moving, particularly if you have toddlers and so on, constantly running around the place. And they can be very, very difficult to capture. So the sports and action mode is actually a terrific mode for using for photographing children. So it's just to give you an idea, you know, even though it's designed for sports and action, you don't necessarily have to use it for just that as well. I see lots of people saying cars as well and bikes and so on. Absolutely anything fast moving like that as well is what you might use this particular mode for. So moving on then, we also have this symbol here, the mountain symbol, and this is for landscape mode. Okay, so this is a mode that tries to keep all objects in the scene in focus. So rather than images where the background is out of focus or what we call a shallow depth of field, this mode tries to make sure that everything is in focus from the closest object in the foreground to the farthest object to the horizon all the way in the background. And the reason it uses this little landscape icon is because typically, but not always, photographers like who are shooting landscapes, they like to keep everything in focus from the foreground to the background within the scene. But again, this mode can be applied to any type of scene or subject. It doesn't always have to be a landscape mode. Then we have our macro mode. Has anybody used this mode on their camera before? The macro mode. And I know there's lots of people who are really into their macro photography. Lisa, you're saying you've used it. Lots of no's coming in on this one. Quite a few yeses coming in on this. If you have a smartphone, you generally, a lot of smartphones will have macro modes on them as well. We'll talk a little bit more about macro towards the end of this lesson, but I mentioned in the first lesson about macro photography, but the macro mode, it allows you to move closer to the subject to try and take close-up photographs. And I actually saw one of the students, Gary, before the lesson, I know you were saying you were having issues photographing military models, so you might actually investigate this mode, Gary. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but macro mode will try to get you closer into a scene. So if you're trying to photograph, say, insects or perhaps food like we were talking about in the previous lesson, this is a good way to get a little bit closer. Now, this function has its limits, but it will allow you to get closer than you normally could if you're just photographing an object normally. So it changes the focus on the lens to be, to make sure it's focusing a little bit closer than it normally could. But for true macro photography, where we're enlarging the object that we're photographing, we do need the correct lenses. We'll talk about real macro lenses at the end of this lesson. Then finally, we have our portrait mode. So again, this is a combination of settings that's best designed for generally shooting portraits. Now, what this mode does, what it tries to do is that it captures pictures where the background is out of focus and the subject that you're photographing is in focus. We have a nice shallow depth of field. This is a technique that's commonly used in portrait photography. But again, it's not limited to portrait photography. You can apply this to any subject where you want the background out of focus. So basically, these are preset modes that the camera tries to use the types of settings that you would typically use in these types of scenarios. But they don't always get it right, which is where you want to try and eventually move away from these modes. Now, I see a lot of people saying they've got these extra modes like the C1 and the C2 and the C3 modes, or the U1 and U2 modes. These are custom functions. So these are ones that you can customize yourself at a much later stage if you wish. They are a little bit complicated, so we don't go into them in this particular course. Now, sorry, gone back a bit there. Now, in terms of the other side of the dial, we have our A, S, and M. So let's break down these modes. A or AV, you might have AV, and Claudia has just said that there, and you've also got TP, we'll talk about that in a second as well. AV is aperture value, or it might just appear as A, but it's aperture value mode. And basically, what this mode will allow you to do is just control your aperture settings. So if you want to control the aperture and you don't want to worry about your shutter speed or your ISO and so on, you might just select this, and it allows you to control your aperture only in the camera. Don't worry if you don't understand aperture at the moment. We will be looking at it in lesson 4. But this is a great semi-automatic function. Because it means it gives you control over one of the fundamental aspects or elements of controlling exposure with your photography. But it also, your aperture controls depth of field. So it starts to allow you to make some decisions about whether you want to have the scene with a shallow depth of field or the scene with with deep depth of field, like if you're shooting a landscape. So aperture value mode, a really great mode, a really good stepping stone into understanding how your apertures work on your camera. And we will come back to this in a future lesson as well. Then the other one is your shutter priority mode. It might appear as S, or it might appear as TP, or it might appear as TV. Okay, so it can appear as different modes. Sorry, TV, Claudia, you're absolutely right. So it might appear with different letters on it, but the function is the same. And it works like the aperture priority mode, but instead we're only controlling the shutter speed. Okay, so we're only controlling the shutter speed on our cameras. Okay, so it means we can make decisions about how fast or how slow we want the shutter speed to be in the camera, and the camera will make the rest of the decisions for us, okay? So Stanley, you're just asking what is aperture. We will talk about apertures in lesson 4, Stanley, so don't worry about it for the moment. But just get familiar with your aperture and your shutter priority. We'll be diving into those modes much more in depth in lesson 4. But for now, we're just explaining what these modes are. Then finally, the Holy Grail. How many of you want to get this mode? How many of you want to be confident in turning the dial to M? Stephanie, Agnieszka, Matt, Dusan, Emma, Dusain, totally, yeah. I think this is really why we're all here, guys. In fully manual mode, you have full control over your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, your focusing modes, your light metering modes, and pretty much every other setting that the camera has to offer. This is a setting that's going to maximize your creative control and expand your capabilities. And this is really what we're building up towards in this course. Over the next few years, your knowledge will build up towards looking at this in lesson 8. Sorry, the next few weeks. Over the next few weeks, your knowledge will build up towards this in lesson 8. I think I said years there. Yeah, so it's the exact same. Peter, you're asking what happens on a mirrorless camera. It's the exact same on mirrorless cameras. They have the same functionality as well. So over the next few weeks, we'll get to this stage where you're going to be making all these creative decisions yourself, and you're going to know exactly how to get the perfect exposure too. So that's a breakdown of some of the modes are on our mode selector, but there is a few other features that you might find on your cameras as well, like night mode or long exposure. I did see somebody mention that a little bit earlier on in the lesson as well. So basically night mode, this can be a really fun one to play with. It really is, it's a setting to give you a combination of settings with your aperture and your shutter speed to give you good low light images. So if you're photographing indoors, or perhaps you want to do the light trails that we had a look at in the last lesson, you might switch it to the light mode or the long exposure mode. Okay, so long exposure mode, Emery, you're asking, basically it means that the shutter is open for longer, and so it's really, really good for if you're doing low light or nighttime photography. Okay, now what might you need to use if you're shooting at night and using this mode? What other accessory might you need to use? Yeah, Lauren, you're totally spot on. Julie, yeah, you're absolutely spot on as well. Ian, William, another William, my namesake. Jesse, you're saying a flash. You could certainly use a flash, but I was thinking a tripod. A tripod it would be definitely something that you'd need to be using when you're photographing nighttime exposures. The next one, video mode. Video has become massive on our DSLRs, on our smartphones, on our mirrorless cameras, on our bridge cameras. Every camera nowadays has a video mode on it as well. And these are getting incredibly advanced too. Like, for example, the Panasonic GH series with their 4K capabilities. You know, it's a huge, video has become huge for DSLRs, mainly because it's so much more affordable compared to buying, you know, the video cameras in the past. So video mode might be one that you might want to play around with as well, for sure. Okay, moving on. The next one then that you'll see on your cameras is your image playback. Some common symbols that you'll see on the back of the camera. Your image playback, very, very straightforward. If you just want to have a look at the photographs that you've been taking, scroll through them and see that you're making sure that everything is all okay on your camera. You might have to zoom in and zoom out on the playback as well. So there's a little zoom icon that will allow you to zoom in on the photograph. And why might you want to zoom in on the shot after you've taken it, guys? For what reason might you want to zoom in on a photograph after you've taken it? Okay, just waiting for a couple of questions. Yes, Solomon, spot on there as well. Kean, you're spot on there. Absolutely. Paul Fernack, brilliant. You want to check the focus. You want to make sure that our photographs are sharp, that they're not going to be out of focus. It can be incredibly frustrating for photographers if you're out there, you're shooting all day, you get home, you put your photographs on the computer, and they're completely soft. You know, they're not sharp. They're not in focus. There may be some other issues that you may not have been aware of as well. So it's important to zoom in on your photographs now and again to make sure that everything is nice and sharp and you don't get any nasty surprises later on. Next one is to delete photographs. So the delete button, for the delete button, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's to delete any photographs that you don't want. But I would always be restrained in my use when using the delete images button, okay? Obviously, there's always going to be times where you take a photograph that's just no good at all and you just want to get rid of it. It's just taking up space on your memory card. But if you're not sure about a picture, if you're on the fence about whether you like a picture or not, don't delete it. That's that's my advice to you. If you think you like a picture, or if you think that you don't like it, don't delete it until you're absolutely sure. You can always delete it afterwards, okay? You can always get rid of it when you viewed it on your computer. Okay, the camera's LCD screen is okay, but it's only a referential tool. It's not until you get your photographs onto your computer that you're really going to see the quality of the photograph. So, show a little bit of restraint when you are deleting your photographs. As I said, there's always going to be those times where there's ones you just need to get rid of to free up some space. But as I said, if you're unsure, you might just keep it and wait until you get home. Okay, and finally then, some cameras will also have a direct printing option on them as well, which means you can actually print direct from the camera as well. So, if your camera has Wi-Fi, some cameras have Bluetooth on them as well. You can hook them up to a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth printer, and you can just simply hit the direct printing button and voila, you've got your print there straight away as well. It is important to print your photographs as well, guys. I mean, we live in the digital era. All our photographs are online. They're all viewed on screens. But there's nothing like having a print in your hands as well. So it is important to be printing off your favorite photographs too. It's a great feeling as well when you've taken a wonderful photograph and you get a really wonderful print of it as well that you might frame too. So do think about printing your photographs as well. Now, so does everybody understand those common features and those modes that we'll find on our cameras? Excellent. Brilliant stuff. Brilliant stuff. Great stuff. So hopefully you've got a bit of a better idea of what mode you might decide to try out as well. So I would put it into practice. Just try and take a photograph on each of these modes just to get a little bit more familiar with them as well. So moving away from that side of it, let's have a look at the other very important part of our cameras, which is our camera's lenses. Okay, so next up we're going to get into the various types of lenses to give you a sense of how different lenses change your view of the world and how and what you can capture. Okay, but the first thing I want to do with our camera's lenses is clarify something with them. There's essentially two main categories for our camera's lenses. We have what are known as zoom lenses and we have what are known as prime or fixed lenses. Okay, so a zoom lens is fairly straightforward. A zoom lens is is a lens that has a variable focal length. Okay, basically what that means is that they either allow you to get closer or further away from the subject just by adjusting the focal length or the zoom of the lens. So focal length is the number that we can see here, 18 to 35 millimeter in this particular case. Okay, and I'll explain that a little bit more in depth in just a moment. But the millimeters that we see on the lenses here, this is what we call our focal length. The lower this number, so when it's at 18, that means it's very, very wide. The higher the number, the more zoom that you have on the lens, the closer to the subject that you are going to be. So a zoom lens is any lens that allows you to zoom in and out of the subject, okay? So the main advantages of zoom lens is that you get a variety of focal lengths and, they're much more, I suppose, convenient in that sense. You can zoom in out of a subject. You don't have to be carrying around loads of different lenses. If you're out traveling and so on, they can be very, very useful. If you're using a Canon or a Nikon, generally most of lenses or most of those cameras come with an 18 to 55 millimeter lens. That's a zoom lens. So how many people are using an 18 to 5 millimeter lens at the moment? Yeah, lots and lots of people. It's what we call a standard kit lens. Okay, the standard kit lens. It's a really, really good lens to begin with. You can get great photographs with that particular lens. It's a very good place to start. So it starts wide. It starts at 18 millimeters and it zooms into 55 millimeters as well. The other types of lenses that you're going to be dealing with as well are what we call prime or fixed lenses. Prime or fixed lenses. It doesn't matter what you call them, prime or fixed, they are the same thing. And basically what this means is they only have one focal length and cannot be zoomed in or out. Okay, so it's only one focal length that we have on these. They cannot be zoomed in or out. Prime lenses can be any focal length though. They can be wide, they can be normal or general, or they can be telephoto. And we'll explain those terms in a moment as well. Now you might be thinking, why would I buy a prime lens when I can have a zoom lens that covers more range than buying loads of different prime lenses? Well, the main advantages of prime lenses is that they tend to be higher quality and produce sharper and more detailed images than zoom lenses. Prime lenses generally are much better for low light photography as well. They let in a lot more light, and this is due to their apertures, which we'll talk about in a future lesson. Prime lenses can really range in price. We talked about the nifty 50 or the 50mm lens in the previous lesson. That 50mm lens is that starts from only, you can find them for about €100 if you know where to look. But prime lenses can go up hugely in price as well. You can go all the way up to about €1,600 for a lens, depending on what one it is you go for. But I have to say, I prefer using prime lenses myself, mainly because the quality of them is higher. But it can be frustrating that you have to carry around so many other different types of lenses if you need to change your focal length. And that's where zoom lenses have the advantage over prime lenses. Now, so does everybody understand the differences there between prime lenses and zoom lenses? Good, excellent stuff. Excellent stuff. That's important to understand for this next part, because when you actually start looking at these different types of lenses, what's to be aware of is that they're available as both prime and as zoom lenses. So let's dive into it. Let's have a look at some different types of lenses that are available to us. So we're going to be starting by having a look at standard or normal lenses. This is what we would call general purpose lenses. We'll have a look at some wide angle lenses. We'll have a look at some telephoto lenses, super wide angle lenses, fisheye lenses as well. I'm sure you're all familiar with the fisheye effect, and we've also got macro lenses too. Okay, and just to reiterate, all these types of lenses are available as both prime and as zoom lenses as well. So you're going to be able to find, a telephoto lens as a prime lens, or you might decide you want to get one that has a zoom range on it as well. Now I see lots of questions coming in regards to different types of lenses and so on. Don't worry, we will answer those questions for you. We'll have our Q&A session at the end as always as well, guys. So let's get into it. Let's have a look at, first of all, we'll break down some of our lenses components, just so when I'm talking about lenses that you'll have the terminology relating to various aspects of the lens. So first off, our front lens element. Okay, so the front lens element, this is the glass at the front of our lens. When we talk about glass in on our lenses, we refer to them as elements. Okay, they're called elements, and there's more elements within the lens as well. But the one that we can see on the front is known as the front lens element. It's a complex piece of glass that allows the light to enter in and to get and compose our photograph. The next thing is we'll have a manual focus ring on the lens as well. So if we're into manually focusing the lens rather than relying on the autofocus, we're going to have a manual focusing ring located somewhere on the lens. And on this particular lens it's located here, but sometimes it's located a little bit higher. On some other lenses it's actually located here as well. But every lens will have some type of manual focusing ring on them. We have a distance scale. Now, not so many lenses have these distance scale anymore, but if you're using your 18 to 55mm lens and so on, they don't have the distance scale on them. But some lenses will have a distance scale, and this simply tells you how far away the subject is that the camera is focused on. Now, and this can just be very, very useful. If you learn how to use the distance scale, it can be very useful for street photography, as you can actually gauge the distance and the focus without even having to look through the camera. But it is a tricky thing to learn. But some cameras will have this distance scale on them. We have a zoom ring located on the lens as well. So the zoom ring allows us to zoom in and out if it's a lens that's capable of zooming in and out. We have our lens mount. So For your camera, you're going to have a specific lens mount. So for example, if you're using the Canon, you have to get a Canon lens or a Sigma lens that has a Canon mount. If you've got a Nikon, you need to make sure you get a Nikon mounted lens and so on. Your lens mount is generally where all the electronics of the lens are stored. It's where it communicates with the camera. Okay, so it does need to be looked after. You need to make sure that if you haven't got your lens on the camera, that it's protected using the rear lens cover. Okay, and sometimes you may need to clean the little connections on it as well. So do keep that part of the lens protected whenever it's not in use. Does everybody understand that it's a very sensitive part of the lens, and you need to make sure that you get the correct one for your camera as well? Excellent. Brilliant. Brilliant stuff. Then we have our autofocus, manual focus switch. I saw somebody just asking about the AF and the MF. So autofocus and manual focus. So if we want to switch between the manual focus and autofocus, if we want to focus the image ourselves, we can switch to manual focus. If we want the camera and the lens to do all the work for us, we might just leave it switched on the autofocus. Autofocus is really, really useful. I would recommend you leave it on autofocus for the moment. Manual focus is great if you are struggling with the focus as well. And then just finally, we've got our thread for our lens filters too, our bayonet for our lens hood. So we can attach lens hoods to our cameras, or to our camera's lenses. You probably have seen these. These are these kind of big black pieces of plastic that you can attach to the front of the lens. These are used to filter out light. So if it's very strong sunlight or anything like that, you can attach a lens mount to lens hood to the front of the lens, and it will help to reduce lens flare or lens glare in particular in your photographs. And then finally, you'll see a little thread on the front of your lenses as well. This little thread is for attaching various filters to the front of the lens as well. We'll talk about filters a little bit later on throughout the course, but you can attach various filters. Some of you may have a UV filter, an ultraviolet light filter. Quite often these are sold with lenses, and they're used just to protect the front of the lens. But you can get other types of filters as well for different purposes too. Okay, now again, I can see some people asking about things like image stabilization and so on. We'll speak about that in the Q&A section. But for the moment, I just wanted you to get familiar with these various components of the lens. Greg, I recommend, generally I'd have the lens hood on all the time on my own lenses. If you use something like a flash and so on, flash can actually cause a bit of lens flare in that, so you might decide to just keep the front of the, you might decide to keep the lens hood on. To clean the lenses as well, I can see Mathilde, you're just asking, how do you clean the front lens? A lens cloth, a simple lens cloth, a microfiber lens cloth, very, very useful to use. The same type that you'd use if you wear glasses. You can just simply use your lens cloth for that on the front of the lens as well. They're definitely the best things to use for cleaning the fronts of lenses. Now, so moving on, let's break down how we see versus how our lens sees. Now that we understand some of the components of our lenses now, let's just actually start to look through them. But before looking through them, we need to understand how our own eyes work, okay? To understand how lenses differ from each other, we need to look at what's called the angle of view of human vision. So I'll just say that again, the angle of view of human vision. This is essentially the view that we see when we look straight ahead and how wide that view is. So I can see some people already have given me the answer. But before I ask you the question, I want you to do something. I want you to look straight ahead. And I want you to look straight ahead and tell me what you think in degrees, how much is the angle of view of human vision. Okay, so when I say the angle of view, is it going to be 100 degrees? Is it going to be 170 degrees? Is it going to be 180? Is it going to be 270? What is it? What do you think is your angle of view? Okay, just waiting for a couple of more answers to come in. Some people saying 180, some people saying 120, 90 degrees. Okay, some varied answers there. I did see one correct answer coming in there. It's a tough question, guys, now. It is a tough question, but I just want to get you thinking about it. Okay, so for most humans, when we look forward without moving our head, we can see at an angle that is about 130 degrees wide. So anybody who said that, well done. But it might be surprising to you as well. Okay, so 130 degrees wide. So basically, if you stand still and don't move your head or your eyes and just look forward, your view of the world is about 130 degrees wide. And you can see that in the illustration here. Now, this might seem very, very wide. But there is a big difference between the width of view that we can see and the width of view that's actually in focus. Okay, so it's not 130 degrees that's in focus, but this is what's called our peripheral vision as well. The extreme left and right of our angle of view is our peripheral vision, and in this area all of our vision is blurry. And while we have a sense of our peripheral vision, it's not clear and it's not in focus. It's actually a survival instinct. It was something that we developed as people so that we could be aware of what's going on around us, but without actually being in focus on it. Okay? However, the area that is actually in focus is a lot less than 130 degrees. So in reality, our area of vision that's actually sharp and in focus is about 50 degrees wide. Okay, and this illustration gives you an idea of the width of our angle of view, and then compared to what is actually sharp and what is actually in focus when we look straight ahead. And again, try this out yourself. Simply look straight ahead, see what's in focus, and see what's kind of out of focus, what's out of focus in your peripheral vision. Okay, so the angle of view relates directly to what we see when we look through a camera's lens. As you change lenses, the angle of view that the lens will capture will either get wider or it's going to become narrower. The difference between the human angle of view and the angle of view of a lens is that the camera's lenses can keep everything sharp in its entire view. So unlike human vision, it does not blur on the peripheries. And we'll have a look at some examples of this in a moment to make it a little bit more clear. But is everybody with me so far? Excellent. Brilliant stuff, guys. Brilliant. So let's have a look at this in relation to our lenses. So let's imagine we're standing on this beach. We're lucky enough to be standing on this beach, and we look straight ahead without moving our head or our eyes from side to side. We're simply looking forward. Then we would have an angle of view like this image here. Imagine this is our 130 degrees wide view, and it matches our angle of vision. However, as we've just learned, we only have an angle of view that's about 50 degrees wide that's actually in focus to our eyes. In reality, most of this image will be blurry to us because of our peripheral vision. So let's just try to visualize that. So this is a slightly exaggerated version of this, but here we can see that most of the peripheries on this image are blurred, and it's only the center that's actually in focus. So if you were actually here standing on the beach looking straight ahead, only a small part of this scene is going to be sharp to our eyes. The rest is going to be out of focus. But we still have a sense of place. We still have a sense of place and a sense of this area as well. Okay? The view from different camera lenses corresponds directly to this angle of view of human eyes. And an understanding of this concept will be extremely helpful to you to understand the view from different lenses. So, Oleg, you're asking about the vertical view. Well, you can just imagine the vertical view is here as well, but it's the same kind of idea here as well, really, with it. Okay, Suna, you're asking how long is the session? As I was saying at the start of the lesson, they're about an hour long, Suna. So we've still probably got about 15 minutes left or so. Okay, so moving on, let's have a look at this. Let's see how all this information corresponds to our different cameras' lenses. Okay, so the first one we'll have a look at is what we'd call a standard or a normal lens. So We have a Nikon 50mm lens here. So here we have a term that comes up a lot when we look at lenses. Standard or normal or general purpose lenses. What this term means is that when the lens is attached to the camera, it sees and it captures roughly the same view or angle of view that our eye sees when it's in focus. So a 50mm lens is actually very, very close to what we see that's in focus without, when we just look forward and look straight ahead. Okay, so going back to our diagram, remember, as humans, we have this angle of view of about 130 degrees, but we can only really see objects in focus with about 50-degree angle of view. So this standard lens can see roughly the same width view as our focused field of view. And in most cases, a standard or normal lens has a focal length of about 50mm, which is why these lenses are very, very useful. So this can change with some cameras, depending on the size of their sensors as well, but we won't go too much into that for the moment. But roughly 50mm is our standard field of view on our lenses. So let's have a look at that. To illustrate what this looks like, we have this image here again. We're back on the beach, and we have a black outline here representing the view that a 50mm lens would have when the camera is pointed at the scene. So the image here represents the entire view that our eyes, this part here represents the entire view that our eyes might see, but this little black square is the 50mm that would be in focus. Okay, so here's another way of looking at it. In this example, we see the entire scene with a black square representing the view from a 50mm or standard lens. So if we actually stood here and we took the picture, this is what we would actually capture with our cameras. These examples should help you to get an understanding of what a standard or normal lens means. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a term that appears all the time in photography, especially in books and websites and so on when talking about lenses. It's also excellent to know when you are thinking about purchasing lenses as well. So is everybody still with me? Is everybody kind of understanding that so far? Excellent. Excellent. Great stuff. Great stuff. So moving on from that, let's have a look at a wide-angle lens now and see how this relates to our human vision. So you may or may not be familiar with the term wide-angle lenses. However, it is another common term in the photographic world. Wide-angle lenses are lenses that can capture images much wider than our focused vision can see. So remember, our focused vision is 50 degrees. Okay, so typically, wide-angle lenses are lenses with a focal length between 24mm to about 50mm. So 24mm are to about 50mm. Remember, when the millimeters are lower, the wider the lens is going to be. So 24 is wider than 50. Okay, so the lower the number here, the wider the lens is going to be. And absolutely, Christopher, these would be used for landscape photography. So wide-angle lenses also have an angle of view from about 50 to about 83 degrees wide. So let's have a look at this. Let's make it visual. It's a lot easier for us to understand when it's visual. Randy, I can see your question there. You're referring to the aperture, Randy. We'll speak about that in a future lesson. Okay, so here we have our 24mm wide angle lens. Similarly to the example for the normal lens, this is the image here, again where we're standing on the beach. We have our 24mm wide angle lens. And remember that anything between 24 and 50 is considered a wide lens. So here, the view from the camera with a 24mm lens is represented by the black square. So the black square here is what our 24mm lens is seeing, and the red square here is what our 50mm lens is seeing. So you can see the vast difference there, just how much more of the scene that the 24mm lens is taking in compared to our 50mm view. Okay, so comparing this to our angle of vision, so again using the same format as earlier, we'll make this visual. So if we're standing on the beach again, this is what our human vision sees, the entire area here. But if we were to take the photograph with the 24 millimeter here, you would see that it takes in this amount of the scene. Okay, so it's taken in a large part of the scene for sure. Now, moving to the other end of it, so moving the far end from the wide all the way up, we go to the other end, which is telephoto lenses. A telephoto lens is any lens that has a focal length beyond the standard 50 millimeter angle of view. Well, I wouldn't even say 50 millimeter, I'd nearly say 70 millimeters really, and it's beyond that is about the telephoto range. Okay, so telephoto lenses are lenses with a focal length that can be anywhere from about 50 millimeters, again I'd say a little bit higher than that, up to about 1,000 millimeters and even beyond. Okay, telephoto lenses will have an angle of view between 50 degrees wide and to very, very narrow to about 2.5 degrees wide. And these lenses are fantastic for getting you from much closer to the action without changing your position. They are used in applications of photography where you need to show more of the subject but you cannot get closer, for whatever reason. Where might you use these particular lenses? So what, Linda, you're absolutely right. They are good for wildlife. Absolutely. They're absolutely fantastic for wildlife photography. You would also use them in situations like sports. Paparazzi in particular as well tend to favor these kinds of lenses because it means that you can get closer to the subject, without necessarily disturbing the subject and so on. And they can be very expensive. Paula is just asking, are they expensive? But it depends. You can still get great telephoto lenses like the 70 to 300 millimeter lens or your 55 to 250 millimeter lens. These are a lot more affordable when it comes to telephoto lenses. Okay, so let's have a look at those lenses in terms of what we would see. So we talked about a 70 millimeter, so we'll start at 70 millimeters. As telephoto lenses have a narrower angle of view than what our eyes see, when you take pictures, the object will be much bigger and be seen in greater detail. So this slide here shows the angle of view with the black square now representing 70 millimeters compared to that 50 millimeters. And as you can see, a 70 millimeter is tighter to the lighthouse. It's a little bit closer to the lighthouse than the 50 millimeters. So in this one, we can see how much closer the 70 millimeter lens has taken us. It allows us to see more detail of the lighthouse and less of the outcrop, less of what we could see on the beach. In fact, we're really moving away from the beach now altogether. 70 millimeter lenses are at the lower end of the telephoto lens scale. In the next few slides, we'll see how dramatically closer to the subject we can get when we increase our focal length. So another common telephoto focal length is 100 or 105 millimeters, depending on the lens or the manufacturer. And here we can see that we get twice as close to the subject as with the standard 50 millimeter lens. Twice as close to the subject than with the standard 50 millimeter lens. And that makes logical sense. 100 millimeters is double 50 millimeters. So we're getting twice as close compared to if we were using that 50 millimeter lens. And just like we've seen before, the image on the left here gives you a sense of the area that the 100 millimeter lens actually captures compared to where we are standing on the beach. And we're getting even closer to the lighthouse now. It's really transformed the shot at this stage as the beach is pretty much gone from the photograph now altogether. Going to the extreme lens, a 400 millimeter telephoto lens is getting into the super telephoto range. And these lenses have incredible focal lengths and have an angle of view from around 6 degrees compared to what we see with our angle of view of 50 degrees. 400 millimeter lenses tend to be very large in physical size and normally need to be mounted on a monopod or a tripod because of their weight, also to help stabilize them as well. And we'll discuss these, in later lessons as well. I'm sure everybody's familiar with these types of lenses we mentioned earlier on. The paparazzi, wildlife photographers, sports photographers, they would typically use these types of lenses. And you can see how much closer you're getting to that little lighthouse when we're using a 400 millimeter lens. Okay, and just to break that down, now we only photographing the lighthouse. You can see how much closer we are to that lighthouse. And this is incredible when you consider the distance of the photographer from the actual subject. If I was to guess, I would say the photographer is standing about 1 kilometer or so from the subject. So the next time you look at some sports photography or wildlife photography in a magazine or a newspaper, you'll have a better understanding of how they captured these types of photographs. Okay, so is everybody still with me? Excellent, excellent. So we are coming up to the hour. We are going to run a little bit over time. So just a couple of more slides to have a look at before we get on to our Q&A section as well. Now, the idea is the exact same with our zoom lenses. So in the previous examples, we've been looking at fixed focal lengths, at prime lenses. But the idea is the exact same with zoom lenses as well. So here we've got a 14 to 24 millimeter zoom lens. So when it's zoomed out at 14 millimeters, we get a little bit more in the scene. And when we zoom in, we lose a little bit at the edges. But there tends to be less distortion when we zoom in a little bit as well. Same with our telephoto zoom lenses too. When we're at 70 millimeters, we're getting this much of the scene in, and then we zoom into 200 millimeters, and we're pretty much just photographing that lighthouse on its own again. So let's have a look at some more specialized types of lenses as well. Beyond wide-angle lenses, we also have what we would call super wide-angle lenses. And these are lenses with a focal length wider than 24 millimeters. So it's 24 millimeters is typically where wide-angle lenses start. So anything less than that would be what we might call an ultra-wide-angle lenses. There are a few common focal lengths that these ultra or super wide-angle lenses come in, such as 10 millimeters, 14 millimeters, 16 millimeters, up to about 24 millimeters. Okay, so let's have a look at how much of a view these guys take in. So in this case, we're looking at the 14 millimeter, and we can see it here highlighted in gold. Just how much of the scene the 14 millimeter lens is taken in compared to our 50 millimeter. Okay, remember the frame of the little red frame is our 50 millimeter there. On the right side, like all the other examples, we can see the actual photograph taken with that 14 millimeter wide angle lens. And it's pretty much taken in the entire scene. There's now very, very little being left out of the scene with that 14 millimeter super wide angle lens. So we've looked at a lot of different focal lengths. Just to give you an overview of how these lenses look, you should get a good sense of what lens to use in what type of situation now. So with our 14 millimeter, we're pretty much getting the entire landscape in the scene, the entire landscape in the shot. So 14 millimeters, really, really good for doing landscape photography. 24 millimeters, very, very good for that as well. 50 millimeters kind of represents really what we would see with our human vision in terms of the part that's focused. Now we're beginning to zoom in, gradually moving up from 70 to 100 to 400. If you check, just compare the 14 millimeters to 400 millimeters. Look at the difference between those. It's incredible how much closer we got to the lighthouse from moving from that 14 millimeter all the way up to the 400 millimeter. Now, Cherie, you're saying you can see a bit of curvature at the edges of the 14mm. Well, it's funny you should mention that, Cherie, because there's two types of lenses we haven't mentioned just yet, and one of those is our fisheye lens. Fisheye lenses give you an amazing view of the world. Fisheye lenses usually have a full 180 degrees angle of view, and this is much wider than our angle of view of what we can see. So we know we can see 130 degrees angle of view altogether. This sees bigger than that. This sees wider than that. This sees 180 degrees angle of view. So in order to get this extremely wide view, you'll sacrifice straight lines in your image. This means that objects can become heavily distorted or warped or curved, as Cherie was saying there, especially around the edges. And you can usually spot a fisheye lens. They're very distinctive with their extremely curved front lens element or glass. As you can see it here, it's like a bowl that sits in front of the glass. And they take a very, very distinctive photograph as well. I'm sure we're all familiar with this type of shot. Fisheye lenses really distort the images, especially around the edges. We can see here very, very clearly. Have a look at the horizon line. You can see just how curved that horizon line is there. Very, very, very curved. So the name fisheye comes from how fish see underwater. When they see the outside world when they look up. This is known as a hemispherical view. A hemispherical view because a fisheye lens gives you 180 degrees field of view. These are a lot of fun. You can have a lot of fun with fisheye lenses. Typically they'd be used in terms of extreme sports. You see them quite often. Concerts, music photography tend to favour, fisheye lenses. Mooley, you're absolutely right. Like a GoPro camera. GoPro cameras, if you're familiar with GoPro cameras, they have a fisheye lens to take everything in and make sure that you're capturing absolutely everything. So yeah, that's a great example, that one, GoPro cameras. And finally then, the final lens that we'll have a look at this evening is our macro lens, our dedicated macro lens. Macro photography is a great way to see small objects and get details in a totally new way. And to get really up close to tiny objects, you need a specialized macro lens or a lens with a macro function. Typically, macro is a function on some prime lenses. Some of you may have a lens that has a macro switch on it. So some lenses actually do have a little macro switch on them as well. But the one that we have here is a 100mm macro lens, the dedicated macro lens. This means this lens can be mainly used for macro photography. You can use it for normal photography as well, but typically they're specialized for just photographing objects or insects that you want to enlarge. Now, we will be discussing macro lenses a little bit more in detail as we continue on throughout this course as well. But these are great. If you're really into your macro photography, you might consider investing in one of these, but they can be a little bit expensive as well. And we looked at this guy in the last lesson as well, David Gilliver, and how he uses his macro photography to interact using these little guys, these little people, and to interact with everyday objects. Really, really creative use of macro photography. Now, so that's it, guys. We've covered a lot in the last hour. I hope everybody enjoyed that. Did everybody understand that? Did that enlighten you a little bit more about your camera's functions and your camera's lenses? Alan is saying, excellent, great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So we did cover a huge amount. We covered... we're building our confidence, first of all, in our technical knowledge by understanding these cameras' functions, these common camera functions. So, as I said, do test them out. Try and take a photograph in each of these different functions to get a better sense of how they work. It helps. We've developed your visual awareness by looking at human vision versus how the camera sees. So now you're going to really start looking at things in a different way because you're going to be more aware of what you can see, how much is actually in focus, and then when you put your camera up to your eye, how much your lens is actually going to see as well. We've expanded your technical knowledge and hopefully broadened your creative potential too. And we're extending your vocabulary around photography. And that's really important. As I said, you can go back, you can refer to your camera's manuals now. And you can have a look at your camera's manuals and hopefully have a better understanding of the terminology and so on that they use within that, within the camera's manual. So